Hello everyone, welcome to what is hopefully going to be the first in a series of videos about translation. This one is going to be about why human translation is not dead, because of course the rise of machine translation. Initially I wanted to make this a lot more general. I wanted to talk about why translation in general is worth studying, I guess. But then it struck me that really the way to go about this is to first of all address the elephant in the room, which is whether we are all going to be replaced by machines. I don't think we are. Anyway, without any further ado, let's get cracking. So, first of all, the good news. The good news is that there is an ever-growing amount of stuff out there to translate. The amount of data on the web doubles every 2-3 years or so, and a lot of it is, of course, commercial. And a fair amount of that is customer-facing data. So the sort of stuff that people want to have translated, because we live in an increasingly globalized world. People want to buy and sell stuff across borders and generally to have the world at their fingertips. Yet at the same time, rather paradoxically, you also have an increased demand for localization. So people want the content they consume to be in their language and to have it in a familiar and culturally appropriate format. All of which is great news for the translation industry. Of course, while the translation industry is not going to go out of business anytime soon, the question is whether there will be any room in the translation industry for actual human translators, or will we all be replaced by machines? There is certainly precedent for a new communications technology destroying an established professional community. What you see here is, so far as I know, the oldest existing depiction of a printing press. It dates from 1499, so about 60 years after the printing press was invented. In case you are wondering what the deal is with all the rotting corpses, well, the Renaissance was a rather troubled period. What with the plague and gunpowder and, of course, the printing press spreading sedition and heresy and mindless distractions from worthier pursuits. So you've got this popular trope in Renaissance art known as danse macabre. The general gist is that death is pulling the reluctant living into a dance, and the reluctant living are of course reluctant, so they're generally trying to get away. Nobody wants to dance with death. Here the guys trying to get away from the zombie type creatures are the cutting edge communication professionals of the day. We have some printers and a bookseller, what we would now consider a tech startup. Of course, the scariest thing in the picture is probably the printing press itself. Prior to its arrival, there had been a booming industry of manuscript copiers. In 15th century Paris, there were workshops of scribes copying university textbooks on things like law and medicine and divinity, and they were struggling to keep up with the demand. The printing press more or less killed this industry. Handwritten documents became luxury items. You would only hire a scribe if you wanted the document to look particularly impressive. If you simply wanted to print a textbook or your latest seditious and heretical pamphlet, you'd just find the nearest willing printer. Maybe slip him a little extra to keep the job of the books if you have written something especially incendiary, so the censors don't catch wind of it. Within a few weeks you'd probably have a few dozen copies. There is no way a human scribe, or even a whole team of human scribes, could compete with that. So the question is, are human translators destined to go the same way as human scribes? Let us talk about the translation singularity. The translation singularity is our own local version of the more general technological singularity, which is the point where machines begin to outperform human beings. So in the case of translation, it is the point where machines are able to perform all or most of the translation tasks that are currently done by human translators. In 2016, Jaap van der Meer, who is a big translation technology guru, wrote an article with the ominous title "The Future Does Not Need Translators." Jaap van der Meer talked to a few other prominent people involved in the field of translation technology, so computer scientists, computational linguists, translation software engineers, and so on. And the general consensus was that we are about 10-20 years away from the translation singularity. However, there is one important caveat. Van der Meer differentiates between fully automated useful translation and fully automated high-quality translation. and the 10 to 20 year timescale is for the useful rather than the high quality kind of translation. The general idea is that a machine does not necessarily have to produce something of equal quality to a human translation. It only has to produce something good enough to be usable. The fact that machines work super quickly often means that the shortcomings of machine-translated texts are outweighed by the sheer convenience of having the service on tap, as it were. This leaves room for the human translator as the high-end, non-glitchy alternative to machine translation. Van der Meer talks about things like transcreation and hyperlocalization. So his idea of a creative translation potentially includes any translation where there is a substantial element of adaptation to the target culture. One of the computational linguists he spoke to was Khalil Simaan. They both agreed on the 10 to 20 year time scale, but Simaan thought that at the end you just have a handful of particularly gifted human translators dealing with especially tricky literary texts. In Simaan's scenario, translation more or less ceases to be a practical trait for human beings. It becomes about self-expression and display of virtuosity. It becomes an art, which is exactly what happened to the medieval scribes when you think about it. A tiny community of professional calligraphers does still exist, but they only deal with a very narrow range of prestige texts, typically something with a ceremonial function, like certain religious documents and fancy award certificates. And the work of professional calligraphers is greatly admired for its aesthetic value and the involvement of human creativity, but not for its practical utility, of course. One way or another, it does look like there is a growing market for the more creative kind of translation, particularly literary translation and the translation of computer games, or perhaps I should say the localization of computer games. Apparently, translated fiction in the UK now outsells British fiction. The Japanese man in the picture is, of course, Haruki Murakami, a Japanese author who has a massive following all over the world. Behind him there is a couple on the motorbike, and they are from the TV adaptation of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, the iconic Swedish crime novel, which is part of a massive wave of Scandinavian fiction that's currently hitting the English-speaking market. And Metro 2033 is a recent Russian sci-fi novel by Dmitry Gluchovsky that's been translated into 34 different languages, including, of course, English, and it was a bit of a cult hit in the UK. It was also made into a game that's been released in a bunch of different languages, and both the book and the game have now had sequels, also, of course, in multiple languages. So, Van der Meer was talking about a 10 to 20 year timescale, but in March this year a team from Microsoft announced that their system had already achieved human parity, that it was producing translations that passed a Turing test of sorts. A team of human assessors could not distinguish the output of their machine translation from the work of professional human translators. Okay, it's only for news texts, which happens to be one of the easier text types for machine translation to handle, and only for Chinese to English, but still a pretty impressive claim, right? These guys posted all their data online, so I decided to take a look. Here's an example of something the system produced. So first of all, the title. Staying up late to watch the Olympics can damage your heart. Absolutely fine, that's a strong start. Brazil's Olympic events are in full swing, and many citizens will stay up to watch them even if they are broadcast in the middle of the night in the country. Right, a couple of relatively minor problems. First of all, the citizens is a bit too official. Perhaps many people will stay up to watch them even if they are broadcast in the middle of the night. And this in the country I'm not sure about either, because to me this sounds like, they're describing some sort of a rural setting, whereas clearly what they're talking about is in the country where something is shown, so presumably to do with different time zones. I think that they could have dropped this phrase, this in the country altogether, and people would have worked that out from context. Next sentence. In response, doctors specifically warned that staying up late to watch the tournament had health hazards that could potentially trigger cardiovascular disease. Now, this had health hazards, that's a bit of an odd expression. But again, not catastrophically. It's still easy enough to understand what they're talking about. The next sentence, right, the final paragraph. If you stay up for a long time, the hormone will still be secreted in large quantities. The human experience continues to be in a state of tension and excitement, unable to get normal recovery, easy to cause vasoconstriction, blood pressure rise, and thus cause cardiovascular disease. Okay, this is where it begins to fall apart a little bit. If you stay up for a long time, the hormone, which hormone? I mean, this is the first occurrence of this hormone in the text, so this definite article, it kind of unseats the reader a little bit. Then the human experience continues to be in a state of tension and excitement. Okay, for starters, this is a run-on sentence, so here we should have really either a full stop or a semicolon. But also I'm not really at all sure what this actually means. I don't know, perhaps what they mean is something like the human physiology, the human body continues to be in a state of tension and excitement. Unable to get a normal recovery. What is unable to get a normal recovery? The human experience, the state of tension and excitement, doesn't make terribly much sense, right? And then you have something that just grammatically falls to bits. But all the same, I mean, you can tell what they're talking about. It's not incomprehensible. And it's if you think about what machine translation used to be like even 2-3 years ago, this is pretty readable, isn't it? Now let's have a look at the human translation. Let's begin with the title. Staying up all night to watch the Olympics makes one prone to heart damage. It's grammatical, but it's a bit on the wordy side, isn't it? To be honest with you, I think the machine did a little bit better. Staying up late to watch the Olympics can damage your heart. That says the same thing, but in a more succinct way. Let's keep going. The Olympic Games in Brazil are currently all the rage. Now, this all the rage, that's an odd expression to use in this context, isn't it? I mean, it means something like the height of fashion. The Olympic Games in Brazil are currently the height of fashion. Well, are there other Olympic Games in other countries that are less fashionable, or are the Olympic Games in Brazil going to last long enough to go out of fashion? It just doesn't quite hang together. There's a bit of a semantic incongruity here of some sort. So at this point I'm thinking perhaps the person who wrote this was not a native speaker. Perhaps it was a translator who is a professional translator, but whose first language and whose dominant language is Chinese. Let's keep going. Even though many of the games are broadcast during midnight hours in China, many fellow citizens will stay up all night to watch these games. Now, there's a bunch of problems here. First of all, many of the games. Now, I'm pretty sure what they actually mean is many of the events, many of the Olympic disciplines. Then you have this fellow citizens, which is an oddly formal turn of phrase for this context. I mean, many people will stay up all night would kind of sound more natural, wouldn't it? So at this point I'm really pretty sure that the person writing this is not a native English speaker, that it's a person who is clearly very, very familiar with the formal rules, they know their grammar, but a lot of the meanings are slightly out, right? They're out just enough to make this text sound peculiar. It doesn't sound unreadable, you can still understand what's going on, but it sounds odd. And if you read through the rest of this, you'll find more of the same. Feel free to pause and have a bit of fun and see how many slight errors you can pick out. In essence, the guys at Microsoft cheated a bit. If you are going to claim parity with human translation, then the translator really should be translating into their dominant language, which is, for most people, their native language. I myself am a bit of a special case in this respect. My dominant language these days is very definitely English, but I still have this crazy-sounding Russian accent. Still, the reality is that at the bottom of the market, people do translate into their non-dominant language, and the results do often look a bit like this. Is this ideal? Well, no. Is it under some circumstances good enough? Well, yes, it can be. Machine translation works best for formulaic texts. Texts with reasonably set structure and a lot of repeating words and expressions. Machine translation systems basically work on statistics. They crunch through vast collections of similar texts in different languages and look for points of likely correspondence, or equivalence. The less variation there is, the more likely the system is to identify these points of equivalence correctly. The problem is that equivalence is a pretty shaky concept to begin with. I don't want to get into the details of why right now, but basically semantic fields rarely, if ever, overlap 100% between different languages. We'll come back to all this stuff in another video. The important thing for now is that some words and expressions do have comparatively clean equivalents in other languages, and others do not. The names of people and places obviously have set equivalents. For example, scientific terms like DNA or nucleophilic substitution also typically have set equivalents because science is an international project and scientists go out of their way to make sure that the concepts they use match up across cultures. Machine translation loves that sort of thing. What it tends to struggle with is language that is in some way unusual or figurative. In the case of unusual language, like for example archaic expressions, it may struggle to find enough reference data. In the case of figurative language, it doesn't know how to identify the specific associations or connotations we are trying to call to mind. So I took a verse from a fairly well-known Russian song and fed it into Google Translate. Before we go any further, let me give you a bit of background information. The song is about an unhappy coachman driving a sled pulled by a team of 3 horses along some deserted country road. So here's what I got out of Google Translate. Now I'm a poor orphan, and suddenly he waved all over the 3, and the song was amused by the child, and he burst into a nightingale. Which, apart from the very first line, does not make a huge amount of sense. So let's try and figure out what's going on here. Let's start with this first line, I'm a poor orphan, the one that makes sense. Here's my own translation of the same verse, and I changed it to I'm a poor wretch. Why did I change it? Now, the Russian word sirotina does technically mean an orphan. It's derived from sirota, which is the standard Russian word for orphan, and it also has this augmentative suffix ina. Now, augmentative suffixes make things bigger, so he's not just an orphan, he's a great big orphan. I think that when you say I'm a poor orphan in English, you are quite strongly implying that you are an actual orphan. You are drawing attention to the fact that you have no living parents. In Russian, this is less clear. Now, this guy may well have no living parents, but I don't think this is the important thing here. I think the important thing here is his mental state. It's his state of wretchedness and general bereavement. Now, of course, he's unhappy because of stuff to do with his love life. Line 2. And suddenly he waved all over the 3. Now, that's a bit cryptic, isn't it? И вдруг махнул по всем по 3. Now, you have this verb here, махнуть, which does mean to wave. It means to make a waving action, like anything you can do with the waving action. So anything from drinking vodka to chopping wood to undertaking a journey without due consideration. It's kind of a throwaway waving motion. All over the 3 clearly refers to his horses. How can you wave all over your 3 horses? Well, clearly he's not just waving his hands over them. He is giving his horses the whip. Line 3. And the song was amused by the child. Now, clearly that's just wrong. First of all, it's past wrong. The only thing here that can be a subject is detina. It should really be the child that is the subject rather than the object. The verb is тешился. Тешиться is to take solace in something or to take pleasure in something, to amuse oneself with something. Now, this child, let's come back to this for a second. Detina is derived from дитя, right? Дитя, again, is a slightly archaic word for a child, and again it has this augmentative suffix ina. So he's not just a child, he's a great big child. So a great big child who is taking solace in songs. Now, a great big child really is a strapping lad, isn't he? Line 4. and he burst into a nightingale. Now, this is genuinely quite tricky. You have this «И заливался соловьем», so the subject is still Детина. Детина заливался соловьем. What was he actually doing, this lad? Заливаться is a curious word. The root, liv, is from лить, from pouring something. So he poured something out with a sense of abandon, I guess. That would be one way to explain it, right? So he poured something out with a sense of abandon as if he were a nightingale. I translated it as he sang out like a nightingale. You could also do something like his song poured forth, or if you're actually a good poet, then you could possibly come up with something a bit less hackneyed. But the point is, what you cannot do is give a relatively straightforward translation of denotational meaning. And that's exactly what machine translation tends to do. So far we have been talking about fairly obvious errors, the kind of errors that immediately mark out a text as something that was not written by a native speaker. However, machine translation is definitely beginning to sound more and more human-like, and that carries risks of its own. Fluency can lull the reader into a false sense of security. There is no guarantee that improvements in fluency come with commensurate improvements in accuracy. This is part of a news article from the BBC Russian service that I fed into Google Translate. On the face of it, the results are not so bad. The agreement concluded during the presidency of Barack Obama provided for limiting Iran's nuclear activity in exchange for facilitating the sanctions regime against the country. If you skim over this quickly, then this sounds plausibly human. It seems to, broadly speaking, hang together. I mean, it's a bit full of these abstract polysyllabic verbs like concluded and provided and facilitating. But then this is a serious grown-up article, and perhaps we could interpret this as serious grown-up language. The problem is, if we look a little bit more closely, then things kind of stop making sense. I mean, it looks like Iran is actually getting punished in return for cooperating. It would be reasonable to assume that the country at the end of this sentence refers back to Iran, in which case we have something like the agreement provided for limiting Iran's nuclear activity in exchange for facilitating the sanctions regime against Iran. We can stretch it and say that we don't really know the context here, so perhaps we are talking about some third country. Perhaps it's a third country that Iran doesn't like, and if Iran cooperates with the USA on nuclear stuff, then the USA promises to tighten up the sanctions on this enemy of Iran. This feels like a reach, doesn't it? And it is. The reality is that there is quite a serious error in this translation, and it actually changes the meaning to its complete opposite. The problem is with this word here, facilitating. The corresponding word in the source text is облегчение, and if we were to give it a reasonably literal translation in this context, it would probably mean something like the easing. And you can ease either a particular process or you can ease a particular burden, right? So you can ease the process of implementing sanctions or you can ease the burden of the sanctions themselves. Now, in this case, Google Translate has obviously got the wrong one, and this is clearly a very serious distortion with some potentially catastrophic consequences if this happens, for example, in some serious negotiations. So the question is whether we can expect problems like this to be ironed out in the foreseeable future to a degree where we can basically trust machine translation to do its own thing without human supervision. I am not remotely an expert on the technical aspects of machine translation, but I can see something that to me seems like a serious obstacle. Machine translation still works like a Chinese room. For those of you who don't know what that is, let me quickly explain. The Chinese room is a famous thought experiment that the philosopher John Searle came up with, and it goes something like this. There is a man sitting in a locked room with a pen and some paper. Somebody pushes notes under his door. The notes are in Chinese. The man in the room does not speak any Chinese, However, he has this massive book of rules along the lines of, if you see some characters that look like this, write down some characters that look like that. The man in the room follows the instructions in his book and himself pushes what he has written down under the door. Now, to the person standing outside, it may appear like the two of them are having a conversation in written Chinese. But, of course, the man inside the room doesn't really speak any Chinese. So far as he is concerned, he is just reproducing a set of random squiggles. The problem is that real human languages are underdetermined. No human utterance in and of itself contains all the information the speaker is trying to get across. Real human communication always relies on contextual knowledge and assumptions about other people's mental states. Consequently, if accuracy is important and getting things wrong incurs significant risks, there still has to be a human being there to make sure that the machine translation is doing an okay job. A machine translation system is not so much an autonomous robot as a piece of office equipment. Now, on the left is a picture of a photocopier from back in the 1960s. It's a Xerox machine, and next to the Xerox machine is a Xerox machine operator. So there used to be a guy in the office whose job was to operate the photocopier. Nowadays, of course, the same machine is much smaller and much easier to operate, so ordinary people like you and I can use it without the assistance of qualified personnel. All you need to know is how to change the ink and how to unclog an occasional paper jam. I think something similar is happening to machine translation. At the moment, people still hire professional translators to post-edit the output of machine translation, because the quality of a typical machine-translated text is still quite low and hammering one into shape takes a fair amount of work. However, as the machine translation systems improve, the job may pass to ordinary people with a reasonable knowledge of a foreign language. If you are currently studying for a language degree, this may well be you in the future. You may well requalify as an accountant or a lawyer, but you will also be the guy in the office who can tell whether a machine-translated text is okay to use and how to fix the errors. Which makes you part of the middle layer in this hierarchy. Now, this video is already a bit of a behemoth, so I'm going to wrap things up here and I'll leave this hierarchy and the other two tiers on it for another video. I hope you've enjoyed it and I hope I'll see you soon. Bye bye.